Martinez Dorner. Patricia is a well-known author and counselor and a pioneer in open adoption and post-adoption services. I've been doing this work for a long time, and Patricia was already here when I got here, and she's somebody that I've always admired for many decades. She's been a relentless proponent of adoption reform and quite effective with her cohorts in Texas. They're at it again around access to records and lots of other changes. Patricia's adoption-focused practice includes education, support, and training to individuals and professionals. She's a frequent conference speaker, including being on the panel for the ethics presentation at the conference that we held last fall. She's also the author of many adoption-related books that you can Google and look up online. Patricia is the adoptive mother of 2 daughters, and so she both lives and breathes adoption both personally and professionally. And with that, I'll give you Patricia. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Glad to have you all here and to be able to share some thoughts with you. Obviously, in the short time that we have, we'll touch on some of the topics that I have found to be helpful as we consider the process of search and reunion. And we talked about the illusions of how it is when we proceed with search and contact. I have to tell you that for many years, I looked toward the time when hopefully people wouldn't need me anymore, because I feel that the right to self-determination is so important. And certainly with the advent of DNA and the widespread use of it, it has been really wonderful to be able to turn off self-direction to people that were seeking their first families, whether it was from the adopted person's side, the birth parent's side, the original parents, extended family, the so many people that are involved in these quests. And so as a result of that, last year, I began the process of gradual retirement so that I would not do searching anymore. I began doing searching back in 1981 when we were considered the lunatics, not only in the search quests, but also in the practice of open adoption, when families would know each other from the birth family side to the adoptive family side. So the creation of blended families and the acknowledgement of blended families. I know that when people are pursuing family quests through the DNA avenues, that the excitement is overwhelming, and I totally understand that. I've been part of that. And one of the things that I have been really concerned about is that in the process of that gray joy, that so often there is that illusion that it will all be very simple once we find each other, and that we can proceed with contact, and that there will be no further issues of challenge. Certainly, DNA has removed the bureaucratic impediments that have existed for so long, and they still are there. We're still fighting for the original birth certificates and records and all kinds of things. But certainly there are no more secrets when DNA succeeds in penetrating those secrets. I have to tell you, I worked with a woman in her 70s, and she was raised by someone that she thought was her original mother, but we weren't really sure. When we accessed records, all the information was incorrect. There was just nothing that really proved to be true. And that was done intentionally by her mother that we discovered was her first mother. But it was DNA that guided us to the truth. And I discovered that on her paternal side, he was one of something like 27 siblings. And it was through the pursuit of the DNA information that we were able to identify the correct father, because there were family members that knew. The issue with DNA, of course, is that in the excitement of locating family, that very frequently original family members, especially birth parents, are revealed to family members that may not have known about them. And that becomes a real issue that could create complexities that might guide to those principal parties not being available to contact because they've been discovered in ways that were uncomfortable to them. So the caution is always indicated. And to have that consciousness as well of who are the helpers in understanding DNA. We have a Facebook group here in Texas that helps people extensively. And there are search angels involved, which is a wonderful help. There are people that really understand DNA results that guide people to identify relatives. And so in the process of that participation, it's really important to lay out one's expectations as well as one's hopes that the people who are helping will help in an ancillary kind of way and not necessarily make contact unless that is requested, that kind of thing. So as we proceed with those things, for me, the search and reunion process has been what I call the healing potential. When we started as prospective adoptive parents, we were very fortunate that we approached an agency that became a leader in the process of adoption, in the changes that occurred in the practice. And they worked very hard at that agency to educate us as to what was known at that time and to expand our understanding by leading us to reading and events that would expand our understanding. And I'm very grateful for that because some of it was book learning, some of it was discussion. But as I began my work in January of 1981, in a program that was created by this agency in order to provide support to people in the community, as well as to educate the community about adoption issues, I began to be approached by people who were now seeking family members. And I now was living the complexities with them that I had read about, but had not experienced yet. And so it became really clear to me that the complexities were many, along with the great joy of being able to get answers and to build relationships. And so as we walk along with this understanding that it is an opportunity for healing, that the search process is something that takes a lot of courage. Anytime that somebody called me saying that there was a desire or an exploration of the search process, I recognized it as a tremendous act of courage, because whether the participant was an adopted person or a birth parent, a first parent, there were fears about what might be ahead, not just the joy of knowing each other, but for the adopted person, the fear of not being accepted, the fear that that birth parent might not be available at any time. Of course, for the first parents, birth parents, the issue that their children would be angry with them and or hate them, all these different things that we learn about that are very central. And I became really aware of so many of the core issues when an adopted person would call me and say that he or she wanted to know who that person looked like. I began to understand what a core deep issue it was, and the question of why was I adopted, the need to know that answer. And in like fashion, for the first parents, it was the need to know that their children were okay, that the decisions that they had made, whether voluntarily or not, that their children had fared well. So the complexities begin from before the quest is undertaken, as people struggle with an approach avoidance for whether the time is right and whether they're able to proceed and accomplish their goals. Once contact happens, it's really important that from the very beginning, the people that have come together establish boundaries as to what are the things that they are comfortable talking about. What are the things that need some time in order to proceed in getting to know one another? One of the things that I have found to be really critical in the development of these relationships is the importance of a respect for boundaries and clear communication, which can be difficult when we have different skills in relationship building, because we are coming together as family, but with no shared history. And that lack of shared history creates many complexities. We sometimes make assumptions about what each other's lives might have been, what values we might have shared. And the reality is that we have to use all our relationship skills in order to grow these very complex relationships. I always tell people that there's no way for me to know where any relationship is going to be at any point in time, because we're dealing with human beings and some unexpected paths and experiences. And therefore, what we have to do is, first of all, understand each other's issues. If we begin to understand each other's issues, then I believe that we are better equipped to pursue these relationships with a greater understanding and compassion and empathy for what may be ahead for each one of us. In order to do that, I think we need to really examine how we prepare ourselves. Again, because I believe in the right to self-determination, I have prepared a multitude of people for their quests. I have participated in their searches from start to finish, facilitating the contact, walking along with them during the early stages of contact and at different intervals in time. I've had people that would be done with me, and 5 years later, they would call me because some new issue had arisen that necessitated just some input, some mediation, some thinking through. I remember one mom that contacted me at one point when she said that her daughter was now about 3 years old, which means that we were talking now about what I call the developmental recycling that happens when these parties come together that have such an incredible tie, but not the shared history and many unmet needs from the early stages of life. And so as people begin to get acquainted, it's not unusual for the adopted person to go all the way back to infancy needs, to needs that related to a time when that first parent was not able to provide and meet those needs. In like fashion, for the first parents, for the birth parents, we see a lot of developmental recycling where they are now experiencing themselves at the age when they were pregnant, giving birth to that child, separating from that child. And so the complexities abound, and the more that we prepare for these, the more that we are able to navigate them, again, with appropriate boundaries. I've had people that have said to me that they had not only a need to stare at each other, to touch each other, to compare the size of hands and feet and all kinds of wonderful ways that we experience one another, but to actually experience baby needs like being rocked. And so again, we talk about boundaries and being able to do these things that meet our needs in appropriate ways that don't make us very vulnerable, because now we are in adult bodies that may have other vulnerabilities. And so the preparation is really critical. It's important that we realize that sometimes we have needs that are similar and sometimes we have needs that are different. And this may relate to the degree of contact that we can manage, how much time we have available to devote to each other, how often we need to be in contact. I've had people that have said to me that they've been on the phone for hours on end because they had this desperate need to do so. But it was important also to be able to convey that there came a point in time when they needed to go take care of their growing children, or they needed to cook, or they needed to go to work. The practical things that affect us all. But sometimes, because our needs may be different and we're not mind readers, we have no way to know what other people's needs are. So it's really critical that as these relationships begin and evolve, that we very clearly talk about boundaries and communication styles and clear communication, so that we can be very respectful of one another and not create any kind of turmoil for either party. I find that works a heck of a lot better. When I work with people on the evolving relationship, one of the topics that I like to cover is pacing. Because of course, the excitement after so many years of living and finding each other is so humongous that there's huge joy and a desire to experience each other as quickly as possible. And so I have people that will say, I want to go visit my family member that I have located next week. And my encouragement is to take time to grow the relationship. again, underlining that we have to attend to the issue of intimacy without history. It really helps in these relationships if we grow some relationship before we get into the deepest of intimacy and closeness. That's not to say we have to stay unattached, of course not. But to grow the pacing, in today's world, we're able to do phone calls, we're able to share pictures, we're able to talk in a multitude of ways. But I tend to discourage people from jumping on a plane after the first weekend of talking with one another, because in my experience in working with people of all ages and stages, and you name it, all kinds of experiences, I have found that when they run into each other's arms physically, that it gets to be too much, that it gets to be overwhelming emotionally. And that then so often what happens is that people go back into their home turf and need to take some time to digest and to process, and sometimes to be quiet for a while. And that gets really difficult to the other party who may not be experiencing it in the same way. So what I have found is that encouraging people to pace it more gently, to grow some relationship, to get to know each other a little bit at initial stages, to spend some time getting to find out how each person thinks, how each person feels, how each person lives, the life experiences they have had, some of the challenges they have had and how they have managed them. So that when they finally do meet one another, there's already an air of familiarity that in some way manages some of the intensity. Of course, the intensity is huge at every stage of this journey, but to be able to be more familiar with one another when people finally meet up with one another. The other thing that I include in the preparation and the pacing is that when a first visit happens, because every step is so mammoth, that it be a brief visit, that the visit be maybe a long weekend, that they don't stay in each other's home. Now, I know there's exceptions to everything. There are people that do stay in each other's home and they do it very successfully. But I have found that, again, the intensity is too much intimacy too quickly. And so my typical recommendation is that they visit each other wherever they feel like they need to, sometimes in the turf of one or the other, sometimes in between, because people don't always live in the same communities, and that they stay different places. The benefit of that also is that it gives some downtime emotionally in order to be able to process at each step of the way, and also to experience the separation that they will have again when they each go their own way at the end of the visit. There's a tremendous amount of fear that I have encountered after first visits where people really wonder if the other person likes me, and will this be the only visit we'll ever have, and all the insecurities that we all have in having such important relationships that have been so impossible before. So again, it's so critical, if we need quiet time to process the emotions that we are feeling, to let the other party know, to let the people know that this is maybe what is happening, so that we can process and not lose faith that our relationship will continue to grow over time. Sometimes people will want to include everybody in the tribe at these first meetings, and I tend to discourage that. Again, there's an exception to everything, but these are such important and intimate times that at these early stages, the topic of adoption, the whys, and what was going on, and what guided you to an adoption decision, how was it with your adoptive parents, all these really intense questions tend to happen. And in my experience, I think it's good when the primary people can do it on their own, and then gradually include other people. And of course, that leads us as well to, how do you include other people? And when do you include other people? For adopted people, one of the challenges for them frequently is, and I ask them this not as a challenge or as a requirement, I ask them, have you shared with your adoptive parents? Because I'm curious to see what their comfort zone is with that, and what their sense of vulnerability is with that. And so My underlying message is you don't have to tell anybody until you're ready to do so. This is an adult decision that you share in your own timing. The vulnerability, of course, for people that are adopted is that if they feel concerned about their parents supporting them in these quests, that there is a fear of losing these parents. And what I try to do is I externalize these issues for them to help them externalize what their underlying fears may be when they don't tell their parents. Not to challenge, not to tell them to tell their parents. I don't do that kind of thing. But I want them to get in touch with what it can be for them when they do or they don't. And for me, it's about as the healing occurs, people get stronger, they feel more grounded, and they feel more able to tell people in their lives, especially their adoptive parents when they're adopted people. For the original parents, for the birth parents, first parent, whatever the vocabulary is that you feel comfortable, the issue is, who do they tell? Do they tell their spouse? Does the spouse know? Do they tell their children? Do the children know? Again, for them, they know what it's like to lose a child. And the greatest fear is losing the family they now have, the vulnerability of having those people be judgmental and therefore offer them scorn. So I share my experience. I tell them most frequently, your children will be very welcoming of this child that was adopted, who's now an adult. However, I'm not a mind reader. I never know how anybody's going to react. And so the important thing is for you to do it when you feel strong enough, when the healing process has evolved to a point where you feel strong enough to tell other people, especially important people in your life. I had a birth mom that I contacted many years ago. All my stories are many years ago. And at that time, she said that only her sister knew, and she wasn't going to have any contact with her child, who was an adult. But she was willing for me to read her letters from her daughter. So I would call her because I always look for ways to keep the door open. I rack my brains for how can I call that person again about this? How can I keep that door open? So I would call her with a letter that I would read, reassuring her that her daughter was not going to overstep, that her daughter was going to be respectful. And finally, the day came when she says, "Do we really need you in the middle of all this? I don't need you anymore. I want to be in direct contact." And so it happened. So I trust the process that guides people to a place of healing that strengthens them to make decisions where they risk their truth and they tell others. And I've seen that very frequently. So the same applies to adopted people telling their parents that they might fear would be disapproving. And I had a case of a girl whose parents were very disapproving of the fact that her birth mother had entered contact. And so she didn't tell them for a very, very long time. And finally, very long time later, she told her mother, and her mother said, "I knew that you had been in touch with her because you have changed so much." And it was a change for the better. Obviously, the daughter had gotten stronger and more grounded and felt more connected to this earth. So these are all really important issues. Another area of preparation that becomes important is to be really aware of the so many stages. And there's an endless supply of stages, obviously, in any important relationship in our life. But at the early stages, it's that joy where everybody's perfect. We're in love. There are just nothing could be wrong between us. But the reality is that as we get to know one another, we all develop some pimples. We all develop some issues that maybe are different from the other person. We may think differently, we may behave differently. And so those become turning points in deciding, where does our relationship go? Can we be accepting of the differences that we may be finding each other, or the challenges that we may be encountering in our relationship? And those are the turning points for how do we work on this relationship? And how do we create a respect between us that we can continue to grow this? What do we call each other? What kind of titles do we use with one another? That becomes another big challenge. Do I call my birth mom, mom? Do I call her by her first name? Again, a lot of the work that I do is to give people permission and to help them bring out the things that concern them or cause them turmoil. And so what I have found is that sometimes people will use a first name. Sometimes they will use a mom kind of word. Sometimes they will float around with those words so that it resonates at that moment. And that's a reality. In life, in order to try to be genuine within ourselves, we may feel differently at different points in time for how we talk with one another. And so it's not unusual for people to claim different words. And for the birth parents, first parents, original parents, can they claim their children as their children? Can they claim their grandchildren? Sometimes that's a real challenge. And so I will often talk with adopted persons about giving those original parents the entitlement. It's about entitlement, being able to truly feel that we have the entitlement to be in each other's life in significant ways, because we are family. We are family that has been separated, but nonetheless, we are family and we are growing relationships. And there's room for everybody. For me, that's kind of the central piece, that there is room for everybody and that all meaningful relationships require work. There's no way around that. And there may be times when we have conflict. There may be times when we need somebody in the middle to help us talk out these issues. I really try to be very respectful of boundaries myself, in that I don't inject myself into people's lives for the rest of their lives, but I remain available. So I have people that contact me 10 years later, 15 years later, for just some time to think things through or to talk with the two parties to help them communicate if they're having some challenge. This is normal life with important relationships. And we need to realize that in finding one another, we may find that the perfection that we hoped for in the other people may not be there. Every family has challenging issues. It may be mental illness, it may chronic illness, it may be the death of someone that's important to us, it may be the principal parties we were looking for. We need to realize that we don't know what's out there. That's why I keep emphasizing the fact that this takes a lot of courage, because there will be people that we approach that are not open to contact because of their own issues. And how do we manage that? How do we get help to manage that? We may find that the people we were seeking have died. How do we prepare for the potential grief and the actual grief that goes on for a very long time? How about the grief that surfaces through these relationship stages that were unexpected? It can be the anger, it can be the loss revival, it can be the intense grief. I have birth parents that express such deep grief that sometimes that keeps them from participating because they feel that if they let that grief come out, that they could die. It's so powerful. And people who are adopted need to understand that in order to manage these relationships so that they can talk clearly with one another about these issues that arise for one another. The amount of preparation and walking through these contacts can happen in a multitude of ways. It can happen through seminars like this. It can happen by reading the wonderful books that are out there where the sharing is happening about the stages and the issues as people walk through this. It may be with a therapist. It may be in mediation. It can be in many different ways, but the more that we prepare and allow ourselves to process, the better it is, because that way we recognize that these are human experiences of great complexity, and that there is nothing abnormal about the feelings that we may have that surge in us, sometimes in very unexpected ways. I want to briefly touch on also that the search process and the reconnection process is not limited to adults with adults. A lot of the work that I do involves what I call the opening of adoptions, which involves growing children. And while some of the process in the way that I operate is somewhat different, because it's adult guided, the children participate in appropriate ways with truth, with preparation, and with support. But it's the growing of relationships between the adults to start with in order to incorporate the growing children and to build relationships that start from an early time. When my daughter was just an infant, I read the books by Betty Jean Lifton, which many of you may have already read. And it was gut-wrenching for me to realize the anguish that adopted people had in their quest for truth and for knowledge and for connection. And I was determined that my children would not experience that. I can't take away adoption issues from anybody. They walk with us the rest of our lives. I recognize that. But I was going to do everything I could to try to bring answers and truth to my children from the time that they were very young. And so I was fortunate that I began working at such an early stage in my children's development, because I also participated in the evolution of open adoption, whereby people did get to know each other and build familial bonds from the very beginning. And I want to underline something because this really drives me crazy. When we were doing this work back in the late 70s and early 80s, we were really doing it because we were learning from the voices of adoption what the issues were. And in order to respond to those issues, that's why we began doing this sharing of knowledge, information, and relationship. It was not an effort to seduce women who were going to have children who were in crisis. It genuinely was an effort to modify practice to be more responsive to the realities that adoptions were going to happen in this world, and therefore to do it as ethically as possible and as responsive a manner as possible. And so this is a very brief overview of some of the issues that arise as people walk through the journey of adoption as a lifetime process, and then look towards the opportunity to find their truth and do it through the search and reunion process. One of the things that I really advocate strongly is that all of us must get involved in the advocacy for the changing of laws, because we, in spite of the fact that DNA is penetrating a huge number of obstacles, the reality is that important documents are still being withheld from people who have journeyed through adoption. And so lending our voice to legislative change that was successful in Ohio and many other states becomes important so that it can be more widespread throughout our country. England has had open records since 1978. By now, we should know that it's not a negative event. By now, we should know that it does not increase abortions. By now, we should know that it creates a healing potential when people know their truths and can make the important connections. One of the things that I say to adoptive parents who are scared about their children connecting with original family is that when original family is missing, the ability to attach is incredibly impacted. And therefore, our children don't connect as tightly to us as when they have all their truths and their needed connections. So rather than being scared that they're going to lose their children, they should feel reassured that the bonds will be strengthened, that their bonds with their children are strengthened when their children have their necessary bonds with people that are important in their lives. The intergenerational impact of attachment breaks is heartbreaking to me. I see it in people who are adopted and the challenges they have in attaching to significant people in their lives, like their spouses and their future children. The same applies to people who have been birth parents or first parents, original parents, whatever vocabulary you prefer, that very often, because of the loss of that child that was adopted, they have a very challenging time feeling truly entitled frequently to the children that they are now raising or were raising before. It's a very tragic outcome of this journey of broken attachments. So the more that we can work on reinvigorating these attachments, on the healing potential for all involved in this population that lives with such complexity, the more that we serve our planet. And that message is what I like to put out there, that the healing potential affects not only the participants, but our entire society. So I'm going to stop for the moment. Needless, we can talk about this all day long. I hope that I've answered some of the questions or some of the needs that you've had, but I would be happy to answer questions that perhaps have come forward for you.
Well, Patricia, we do have some questions. So one is just briefly, what book did you reference that you read to your kids?
What did I do? What? I'm sorry.
I think you mentioned reading a book to your children.
Oh, the book that I was talking about was Betty Jean Lifton's books, Twice Born and Lost and Found. And my daughter was just an infant at that time. And I cried for weeks. It was so impacting to read that book, those books. And at the time, I didn't even understand the titles, I have to tell you. I feel that as the years passed and my immersion grew, that I better understood those titles. I don't know, I understood the way she did, but for me, they had profound significance. That Twice Born and Lost and Found, where it was, but the content was so impacting that I was determined my children would not live with that. And I began searching for their birth mothers almost immediately. For both my kids. And I got their original birth certificates very early too, because the people who were helping me learn how to search were the searchers, were the people within the movement. So I was very grateful for that. But reading expands our horizons. So one of the things that I encourage people when I'm doing this work is for them to read, to participate, to keep learning, because that's how we deepen the understanding of our own journey and the journey of the others who are impacted by whatever we're participating in.
Thanks. So one of the trends that I've noticed is having that searches can go very quickly these days. So, you and I remember the days when people would struggle through. My own search in the 1980s took me a year, which of course today would take a couple hours maybe. But things happen so quickly, and I would even venture to say that people younger than me, grew up in a different generation and maybe didn't witness firsthand as much as I did growing up in the 60s and 70s what our society was like or what challenges maybe people faced. So what advice do you have for people who are, that this happens very quickly or almost overnight and all of a sudden they've got somebody's phone number?
Well, and that's why I believe that the preparation and pacing are both so critical. And to be able, before they plunge into a contact or even a search, to try to do some reading, to attend these kinds of programs. There's so much out there. I guide people to all kinds of articles. I send out articles that become food for thought. I guide them to websites. I encourage them to look. Again, the way that I work is I don't try to make myself the only resource for anybody. And so I try to expand the horizons so that they're better prepared before they make a contact. And I want them to really think about the pacing in advance and to hold themselves back from that enthusiasm to plunge into it full speed ahead. It's really critical because it has a way, when people move too fast, to get in the way of a potential ongoing relationship. So that gradual pacing really benefits people. And there may be times when people need some help in assessing their pacing and how they're managing the relationships. So I do that with people all the time, because the reality is that we still have a scarcity of therapists in the community that are skilled in the topics of adoption. There are lots of skilled therapists who have all the skills they need, but they don't know the issues. So that's part of our work too, to teach them what the issues are so they can better attend to it when people need that. But there are support groups, there's coaching, there's all kinds of resources out there that can guide people so they don't jump into it blind. And even when I would be doing searching, I find people in 5 minutes. But before I go forward, I prepare people and I'm there to walk with them on their quest. And then I get out of the picture when it looks like they don't need me anymore at this point in time. But when people are doing it on their own, it's really important for them to have those two words in their brain: preparation, pacing, stages of relationship, complexities, to know that it's normal to have issues in these relationships that they imagine would just be wonderful, exciting, fabulous relationships.
So
They're
just because you
complicated.
have the phone number doesn't necessarily mean you should dial the phone right away.
Well, it's relationships, with any important relationship, whether it's relationship with your parents, your spouse, your children, they're all complex. Important relationships are complex. They all have all kinds of chapters to them. We have to manage them the best we know how. And so, and people's skill levels are very different. So sometimes people are very skilled in communication and boundaries, and sometimes they're really bad. Here's the other thing. I tell people not to bring money into the picture because sometimes there's inequality in funding abilities. So if a first visit's going to happen, sometimes one person can fund it and not the other. I say, okay, for the first visit, it's okay if somebody funds it, pays for the flight, pays for the hotel, but please do not make money part of your relationship, because that has a way of messing it up. So if people can manage it, they manage it. If they can't, then let's stay at a distance and get to know each other better.
Good. We have several questions in chat, but the question that we got ahead, I think this is a good segue too. What tips do you have for navigating that initial contact? So do you have recommendations? I know this is a question that Tracy, our search specialist, gets a lot and walks people through.
Is the question about how do you approach somebody, or the first conversations that one has?
I think the first contact, phone call or letter, now Facebook or email, and that maybe that initial conversation.
When you're making contact,
Yeah.
Well, if people are going to make their own contact, what I try to do is guide them to yes, no questions. If they're making a phone call, if they can find, everybody has a cell phone these days and we can't always find a cell phone. But if they're going to make a phone call, it's really important to make sure that the person they're calling can talk privately. And so to say, I'm calling you about something very private, can you talk right now? And people become kind of alarmed by that, but we've got to be careful. And so as we keep moving and saying, I'm calling you about this date, does this mean anything to you? And sometimes the reality is that for birth parents who've been greatly traumatized, sometimes they don't remember the birth date. And this is another whole area of lifting the burden of guilt from them, to say, when you're traumatized, that's pretty typical. But to just begin to share what it's about with great caution. Even in letter writing, we have to be careful, because unless we know that that person we are contacting is living totally alone, the letter even has to be cautious, because we never know what the boundaries are in anybody's household. And so I kind of feel my way with the kind of letters that I write, dependent upon what I have learned about the people I'm seeking. And I may say, I'm contacting you on behalf of somebody that knew you a long time ago. I only say the truth in my letters because I want to be very cautious about how I write these. And then I will say, this person knew you a long time ago, and this is the birth date for that person. And this person comes with great respect and hopes that it will be possible to be in touch with one another, that kind of thing. Brevity. In some situations, I even include a picture if I know enough about the person I'm approaching that I feel safe in including a picture. One of the things that I do most typically is that whoever I am representing, I ask them to write a letter, so that if I'm making the contact, and because I've often been a court-appointed intermediary, I've had agencies give me files to work with, then I have letters from the people that I'm representing, so that I bring in their voice. I want it to be their voice, not mine. So it resonates. And so I read the letter so that that person can hear something about the person that's coming forward, that kind of thing. I have to say, I have made contact with people through Facebook when I can't find an address that I can be sure of, or there's been no response. And again, it has to be very cautiously worded. I would like to be in touch with you. I have some important information to share with you, that kind of thing. But caution is always indicated, because we want to be sure that other people don't get involved that could make that person vulnerable.
Exactly. Yeah. We had a question about comparing and contrasting search issues between voluntary or infant adoptions and public system agency adoptions.
I work hugely with people that have been adopted from foster care, and the needs are the same. The need to know, the need to connect. I have gone with people that were adopted from foster care who came out of terrible situations, and gone with them to meet the birth parents who still are having challenges. But it's all about knowing one's truth and being ready for one's truth. And sometimes the people that were separated because of foster care issues are still having problems. Sometimes they're not. Again, I'm not a mind reader, but I believe in the healing potential. And so I have been involved in adults making contact with original family, as well as growing children who were in the foster care system, who then were adopted. And for them, of course, the adoptive parents have to be involved. And what we do is when I'm involved, I do a lot of risk assessment when it's children in particular, to see who in that family system can be part of this connection process. I have to tell you, I've had incredibly touching situations where the birth father was in jail, and where before I had been allowed to go visit in the jail, this time they wouldn't let me go. And so I sent the letters, sight unseen, really. I wasn't able to talk with him at all. This man wrote the most gorgeous letter to the adoptive parents, thanking them for being there for his children, for loving his children. He was the most non-threatening person on this earth. He was in a controlled situation where drugs were not part of his journey. And he expressed his love for his children in such mammoth ways. So we must not overlook the healing potential for all those people. We have a judge here in San Antonio who has really understood the mental health value of maintaining contact between the families that adopt children from foster care and their birth relatives. And he encourages that, done with caution and care and boundaries and all those wonderful things. But yes, I'm a huge proponent. And the reason I got so involved with that is because I was doing all the search and reunion. I was involved in open adoption. And I thought, why aren't we doing this for people coming from foster care? And I actually wrote a manual for Catholic Charities USA a million years ago. That segment of it was focused on that population, on how to work with that. I just find that really important. Was that brief enough?
Yeah, thanks. We had another question about boundaries. I'm not sure I understand the full question, so if I don't portray it correctly, Christine, if you want to come off mute, you want to ask your question directly? Oh, we can't hear you. I'll read it. Oh, there you go.
Is that good?
Yep.
Okay. I was having trouble with my audio and I had to call on my phone, so I apologize. So I've been in contact with my birth mother and her and my half siblings now for about 15 years. And when I had my children, the boundaries that my parents, my adoptive parents, kind of had in play and thought were appropriate shifted a bit. Because we've been in relationship for 15 years. So my question is, how do you navigate when your boundaries look different than the other parties involved in the relationships? I've tried a bunch of different things. I've tried just not talking about it. I've tried being very honest about it. And I'm in the moment where I'm struggling with, hey, I've built a relationship with my first family and my half siblings, and it's really beautiful. But my parents are pulling back, and I'm just navigating all of the stuff that goes with that. So
it's very interesting. Grandparenthood brings about lots of stuff where people become very possessive of those children. And we have to give them the message that there's room for everybody. And you have to keep banging it in their heads, because the vulnerability that adoptive parents have is that, again, that birth family is going to be preferred. They're younger, blood is thicker than water, and blah, 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 right? So you have to keep communicating, but it may be that you create a boundary that's continuously clarifying that there is room for everyone, and that you have a relationship that's going to exist for everyone, and that these children are going to have grandma and grandpa over here, and grandma, grandpa over there, and grandma, grandpa over there, and grandma, grandpa over there. And there may be 8 or 10 people, because people get married and divorced, and there's room for everybody, because your children are able to grow all these relationships. Just as your parents were able to love you as their child, and possibly some other, are you a lone child, or you have siblings?
I have an older adopted brother as well.
Okay, so and you have to sometimes put it crazy and say, you couldn't love me and my brother. That was impossible, because you didn't have it in you to love both of us. And when they say, oh, you're crazy, of course, then why can't my children love all their grandparents? And why? But sometimes people feel insecure and need to feel being the preferred people. And maybe you need to address that everybody can be preferred, and that the children have a right. And if your parents have trouble with it, they need to go get therapy. Sometimes you're not the one that needs therapy. You may have to say to them, there's some issues that obviously are troubling you, And it could be helpful for you to go and see someone and talk about it. Or maybe we could go as a family, or maybe you could do a three-way where you, your parents, and somebody else can do this kind of thing, a Zoomie.
Yeah.
Because
Yeah.
sometimes we just have to keep digging for what are their vulnerabilities. They want to possess you and your children, and it doesn't work that way. We have the capacity to love countless people. We can love in a million different ways, all kinds of people.
Okay.
No
That was
magic
my gut.
answers, but we keep working at it. We keep working at it, and we keep challenging them of what is it about it? What is it about it?
I think it's just been really difficult because they keep pulling away when I need them the most. When I've had my children, they're gone. They disappeared, and have canceled family outings and things like that because it's of their choice. It has nothing to do with me. I've told them countless times, like, I have room at the table for everybody. I'm a very wide open, everybody's welcome sort of person in general, which is just different than their philosophy. They're a little bit more closed. Like, this is my family. And I get the concept. I get the complexity. I get all of it.
Yes, of course. But they're obviously feeling vulnerable. And so they may
But they won't talk to me about it. And that's the piece that really frustrates me.
It's all via text
that they've canceled things.
Yeah. Have you ever written them a letter? Just different ways to communicate a letter that expresses your thoughts and feelings, and that doesn't work. Sometimes our parents are toxic. What can I tell you? Sometimes people's toxicity guides their behavior. Their vulnerabilities guide their behavior. And you don't have to turn your soul over to them because of your parents. It may be that they're not able to attend these events because they can't cope with it emotionally. And that's a reality. That's a real. It's like when people say, I told my parents that I've made this contact and they're really upset. Well, you don't have to be upset with them. They need to work on it. And for now, you strengthen yourself and you do your healing and then see how you interface with them. Create your healing potential and strengthen yourself and keep getting grounded and more grounded. And maybe the day will come that they find their own healing.
Thanks. We have a couple other questions that I'm going to combine because they're both about siblings. So I think I've seen this come up frequently. I'm sure you have as well. So having information about maybe discovering information about the birth parents that the kids that they raised don't know, and whether or not to share that, even though it might shed some light on the situation, or situations where a birth parent's not interested in contact, and then the adoptee is faced with a choice if they're going to contact siblings, even though maybe that's not what they think their birth parent would like to see happen.
It's a real challenge because we want to respect the boundaries with the birth parents, and yet there comes a time when time has elapsed and we've given that birth parent a lot of time to consider and to process. And I'm at the point where I tell people, you may have to decide the timing and the risks. It's all about risk assessment, the risks of telling your siblings, and you have a right as adults to enter into contact if you're ready for that. And the reality is that, again, for birth parents, so frequently the fear of contact has to do with the fear of losing the families that they have at this time, their children, their spouse, and the standing they have in their community. And they're frequently shocked that their children are excited to discover that they have a sibling. But the fear of losing people that are important is what so often keeps birth parents from participating. I have a man that I've been working with for a million years. I tell him I'm his godmother already. And because really I care about him so much. And the fact is that he has now found everybody who was not available years ago even. And there are many siblings, but he has really waited and waited to contact siblings because he really has wanted the contact with the birth parents. I don't know when the day is going to change for him, because we're talking a lot of years that he has tried to be respectful of the privacy of those birth parents, both mother and father. So, but it's a very personal decision of risk assessment.
Oh. Thank you. We're running short on time, and so I'm going to go ahead. I'm going to post the link to our programs. We have general discussion meetings several times every month, and these are exactly the types of things that people talk about. Also, Tracy is a wonderful resource, our search specialist through Adoption Network, and so you can get individualized assistance. I know there's a lot of questions, and this brought up some wonderful conversations. So thank you, Patricia. With closing comments, thank you everybody for joining us, and Patricia especially for sharing your wisdom and volunteering your time with us this evening. As many people here know, Adoption Network Cleveland is a nonprofit organization. We serve individuals and families impacted by adoption, kinship, and foster care through support, education, and advocacy. To find out more about our organization and to support our work, you can visit our website, adoptionnetwork.org. We are a membership organization, and we hope that you will consider joining us as a member. And we hope to see you at some of our upcoming programs. And as I mentioned, we do have our next Monday evening speaker series in 2 weeks. We actually have a discussion group around the TV show This Is Us that's happening next week. As anybody who watches that series knows, it's chock full of adoption themes and good fodder for conversations. So lots of different ways to continue the conversation. And this was just so valuable this evening, Patricia. And I can't thank you enough for taking time out of your schedule to do this for us.
I always enjoy it, and thank you for the participation of all the people that attended. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you so much. Have a good rest of your evening, everybody. Thanks for being here tonight.
Good night.
Bye-bye.
Chat.
Oh, good. Yeah, there was a lot of good things in there.
Hi, Darren.